and this was a bit of a revenge match for him, even though it was, his Carolina tenure was outside of his control, visa issues and whatnot. But the thing that stands out to me, and obviously, we've talked about Carolina's search multiple times over the course of the season, but losing the 6-5 search here after you win two searches against OpTic, is that again more of a reflection of OpTic's S&D play, or what? I'm not really sure, but the two hardpoint wins were both, almost over 100, 250 to 156. That's a 94-point win, and then 250 to 135. So it's both, 100-ish point wins, and the two hard points is pretty impressive out of Miami. So this was a solid win for them, more than I would say like a concerning loss for Carolina. But again, it's at that point of the season where every loss matters, and definitely, seeing some of those parallels you were mentioning with the previous Vegas squad, and talking about like them having the opportunity to seize themselves and control their own fate with another win here, have a 2-0 week, and they just weren't able to take advantage of that.
So as you were just saying with Miami, like it's a big win for them, and that kind of started this day on Saturday. Like big wins, like it seems like really meaningful victories for obviously Miami in that first match, and then we go to LAG. They win their match. Vegas wins their match. Obviously with LAG, they beat Boston. So we both picked the Gorillas. This wasn't an upset by any means. Boston now extends their history-making losing streak, 15 in a row. And LAG, more importantly, I think, at least for this conversation, they get a much-needed win. We've been talking about all season long how bad LAG has been online, and that's been a real big detriment to their season because they've been able to get, I don't think so in Major 3, but in Major 1 and Major 2, they were able to pick up quite a few points through their major placings, and that's essentially kept them afloat and kept them, on par with some of those teams, and they've been sticking around about 8th place right now. But this is a big win for them, and I'm sure teams are very happy to see Boston pop up on their schedule late in the year. Like this is a team that is in complete disarray, and for all the issues that some of these other teams have, a team like LAG is probably thanking the good Lord above that the Breach are on their schedule, that they can get a win, and this keeps them on pace with Vegas, Carolina, and Minnesota. Now there's a 4-way tie for that 8th place. So that's a huge win for LAG. What did you think?
Well, we'll get to the 4-way tie happens because of the last match of the day today, but obviously that can't happen before this one. And this was one I at least said on the last episode that, given the state of Boston and their level of play over the last couple of months, and LAG's play online in particular, this was potentially a winnable match for Boston, and LAG just shut down any notions of that here with a solid 3-0 victory, very convincing in all three maps. So really, not much you could say. I mean, technically, even with the tie, like I guess LAG jumped Minnesota now, but that's you're still playing like the team. I'm talking about Boston. Boston's in last place. Your playing a team directly above you in the standings, not like the team all the way in first. And it's not a very competitive series. Like that's just kind of sums it up for Boston. It's just a really bad way to go out, and like I said a couple minutes ago, really I'm just looking to see how long this losing streak continues, and I have a strong feeling it's going to be a case where Boston doesn't win a match the rest of the year.
Yeah, and we talked about that. I think you just like briefly mentioned it earlier, and like a few weeks ago now, or maybe now a month ago. You're like, it'd be kind of weird if they didn't win at all. And I was saying like, but that's a long time not to win, and now we're getting there, and it looks like it could be the rest of the season. And I should mention that they have now lost, I think, like 13 or 14 consecutive maps in a row. They lost 14 consecutive maps because they lost the final 2 maps of their series against Minnesota in the first online qualifier of these qualifiers, and then they've been swept in their last 4 matches. So I don't remember what the exact longest map losing streak is, but they could be getting there. 14 in a row is nothing to scoff at, and
Yeah.
like I mentioned earlier, they play OpTic in their first match of this week, so it is not getting any easier for them. But yeah,
Well,
big. Oh, what were we saying?
I was gonna say you added that onto the notes here, Ray, about this potentially being the worst team ever for the
Yeah,
CDL
I
era.
I was just thinking, you know, there's really not that many teams that really pop out like that. Obviously,
No.
the Paris Legion do. That last Paris Legion team that had the previous record for the longest losing streak, and even before the CDL, I don't remember there being like atrocious teams other than that Epsilon team that Dave was very apathetic about. But like I can't really think of that many teams that have just been so not disappointing is probably not even a strong enough word, but like so hopeless. Like they go into each match and like you're expecting them to lose every single match now.
No, I'll say it straight up. If they don't win a map the rest of the year, not even a map, a match the rest of the year, and if they get last place finish at Major 4, they will have gotten a 12th place finish at every major of the year and will have a historic losing streak. I definitely think that's grounds to say like cemented worst team in CDL history by far. Maybe if you look at like COD overall history and all that, then you might be able to throw some other names in there, but I definitely think in the CDL era, because even like you're talking about like the Paris teams, I would say one of the teams that would be at least like in the conversation for maybe not worst teams, but biggest letdowns in the CDL era was that original Seattle Surge team in MW
Yeah, they were stinky.
2019 with you know with
Karma and
Octane, Karma, Enable, Slacked. Like people had high expectations for that team, and they did not play well. But they still played a lot better than Boston is playing right now. So I think if Boston ends the season with no more wins, another last place finish on land to solidify 4 last place finishes at all 4 lands, I think 100% they are the worst team in CDL history.
I I would just push back with this because I had kind of forgotten how bad the Paris Legion were, because like obviously it's been 2 years now, and they're not the Paris Legion anymore, they're the Vegas Legion. Last year kind of rinsed a little bit of the bad taste out of my mouth about the Legion. But that Paris Legion roster in 2022, they won 2 matches all season. They were 2-23. This season, if Boston, even if they lose out, so they lose their remaining 2 qualifiers and then they lose the major 4, they would be 5-28, I believe. So they would have more than double the number of wins. So maybe they might not be the worst team, but I definitely think like and Paris had this too, where Paris, they would come close and you'd be like, man, like they're just a little bit away from picking up some of these wins, and that's probably like the majority of teams anyway. But I don't know, like I think Boston is way more disappointing than Paris is, because I didn't think anything of that Paris roster. Like obviously we've talked about it before, like I really like Temp. I think he's a very good player, and like he was obviously like the best player on that team, and they just kind of like stunk. Like you couldn't really do anything about it. But that roster, other than him, was pretty bad. Like I didn't really expect a ton from that. This Boston team, we had talked about it before the year. Like we thought they could make champs. They had Priesta, who was coming off of a world championship. Yeah. They had Slasher, who was on phase last year. Obviously, Capsule was a very promising young player, and we've talked about Snoopy a lot. Like they're up there with Seattle, that first or second Seattle team, because Seattle before Pred and Sib was pretty bad, but they're one of the most disappointing teams and the biggest letdowns in COD history. Like there's no way around that, especially if they lose out the rest of the season. They are just one of the worst teams in CDL history or Call of Duty history, and there's no reason for that. Snoopy's supposed to be a almost like a star player, and he's gonna be on one of the teams that, well, he is on the longest losing streak, and Who knows what the map losing streak will be, and it's a bad situation for Boston. And they're an organization we have mentioned in the past that has been very competitive, like surprisingly competitive at times. And especially with how they came into the CDL, they were so late in the process, and they built a roster that was able to make champs that first year. For them to kind of lay an egg like this year, I think that's a huge problem. And we talked about it earlier in the year. It wouldn't be surprising to see some organizational changes at the end of this year, just simply because, like, what do you even do when you have such a bad season like this? Like, any traditional sports team would probably wipe out the front office, the coaching staff. Like, most teams just completely start over at this point. And Boston is just at that point right now where they can only shrug and be like, I don't know what to do. We can't make that many more roster changes. It's not going to help, most likely, unless we, just bring in like these ridiculous challengers players. And if you're a challengers player, do you even risk possibly like getting a reputation for however bad Boston does the rest of the season? That's something that we've also talked about with other teams. I just very, very stunned by how bad they are this year.
I will say, I was just going back to look. I do not remember uh, Paris only winning two matches for an entire season.
Yeah.
So that's got to factor into the conversation. But I did just take a quick look at the 2022 season for the Paris Legion, and if the COD Wiki is right, I don't know how this would make sense, but it's saying they got a top 8 finish at Major 1 in
Yeah.
Vanguard.
Mm-hmm.
So
They won one qualifier match all year.
But that would mean they won. Oh, so they only won one qualifier match.
Yeah, so they didn't win any qualifiers in qualifier 1. Then they got the 8th place finish at Major 1. Then they won a qualifier match in the second set, and then they didn't win a match the rest of the year.
Wow. Okay. But that they at least did not come in last place at every LAN event.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So that we can talk about this more if and when the season wraps up for Boston. But that should be weighted, I feel like, even though 2 and whatever their record was, 2 series wins overall is really bad.
Yeah, they were a bad team. I wish we could have a time machine and bring the Paris Legion to now, or take Boston back then, and just to see which team is actually the worst. But that's a hypothetical clash of titans. Seattle versus Vegas was the next match. These are two teams who, are, I would not say good. I think that is an overstatement. They are mediocre teams, but at this point, we'll talk about it obviously in a few minutes. But Vegas, they win 3-2. They continue their little run of success, which is very surprising considering how poorly they did just as a few weeks ago. And Seattle loses this. I think that's, like, this is a big match for both of them because they're both really trying to fight. And obviously Seattle might have a chance to get the 5th seed, which would be huge for them. Well, I don't know if it's better or worse right now, but it could be huge for them. In Vegas, they're trying to get into chance qualification as well. What did you make of Seattle versus Vegas here?
Yeah, I thought this was going to be an interesting match heading into this set of qualifiers. I just thought both teams are kind of in a similar spot, not only in the standings, but based on their recent performances, with Seattle getting some wins. Obviously, Vegas had the win over OpTic. Seattle had the win over Toronto, right? I think. I'm not misremembering that.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, but so yeah, both teams are kind of, in a similar place heading into this match. I thought this was going to be a good one, and it turned out it definitely was a close match. Vegas takes the first 2 maps, and then Seattle's able to win the next 2 to force a game 5, but Seattle wins the search, takes both search to take the series. There was a 100-point club in there by Seattle in the map 4 on Karachi, so that was definitely noteworthy. Obviously, we've talked about Seattle throughout this year. It's kind of, throughout the multiple iterations and roster changes, it's been the search and destroy that's been a focus. And if you told me, like, the original Seattle roster was out here, 100-point club in a team, I probably wouldn't have believed you. But obviously that's kind of goes on to show just how different this current Seattle team is from that roster they started with at the beginning of the year. So even though Seattle doesn't get the win here, I still think they're in a decent spot. And obviously they've been playing their best COD of the year towards the end of the season, which back to the OpTic convo is what you can ask for at this point in the season, what you want to see. So despite not getting a win, Seattle's in a better position than potentially they might have been a couple months ago. And for Vegas, at least, this was a good win. And we'll get to their second match here in a bit. But if they had lost this one and then had their second match, it would definitely be a different conversation. But for now, Vegas picks up a much needed win against a team in a similar position to them in the standings to please the Paris, or see, I already messed it up, to please the Vegas's winning champs crew.
Last match of Saturday, Toronto versus LAT. Not a surprise in terms of the result, but definitely a few close maps here. LAT did give a pretty good fight, but ultimately lose 3-1 to the Toronto Ultra. The Thieves win a round 11 in S&D to take their only map of the series. But, I think this was pretty much what you would expect out of these two teams. LAT is not an incredible respawn team. Toronto is obviously the much stronger overall team, and they proved that here.
I'm just going to loop in this next match, too. The first match on Sunday for Toronto is Toronto versus Minnesota. It's another 3-1. Both of these matches, Toronto versus LAT and Toronto versus Minnesota, Toronto wins both 3-1, but they lose the search. So they go 6-0 in the respawns, but 0-2 in the search this weekend. And then I'm scrolling a little bit more here too in the results, and they played Miami on Sunday, June 9th, which was last Sunday. Toronto won 3-1 there. They lost the search to Miami. I'm going to keep scrolling here to see if this continues, because obviously we've kind of talked about Toronto search a little bit. They had a 3-0 over Vegas on June 1st.
And then they lost 3-2 to Seattle.
To Seattle with the reverse sweep. So they've won 2 searches at least. But that's 3 straight matches where they've won 3-1 and lost the search. So they're 0-3 in their last 3 searches. And they got a match coming up this week against 2 tough teams, and one team in particular, obviously, I'll just say they're playing FaZe and OpTic. We've already talked enough about OpTic on this pod, but this is a matchup between OpTic and Toronto that's obviously going to be exciting, but it's also a match where 2 teams are struggling in search and destroy. But one of them has to win at least one search to win, not even win this. Just somebody has to win the map too.
That's what you think.
It's going to be, but somebody has to win it. So yeah, I mean, obviously it's great. Toronto gets another 2-0 week here. But yeah, definitely jumping out to me that, they lost a handful of their last few searches, and could be, I feel like that was the conversation a little bit heading into Major 3, if I remember correctly. Maybe it was the Major 2 qualifiers, and I'm mixing up in my head. It's been at a point this year where I know I've said on the podcast, like, they went undefeated in hardpoint and search at Major 1 to win that tournament. So obviously, unless you just stay undefeated in the mode, which no team is going to do, then you're technically going to get worse or see a downturn in your performance in said mode when you start losing it. But it feels like that has been a conversation with Toronto now a little bit. Just the search and destroy situation they've had a couple losing sprees here and there throughout the season now, it feels like, and we'll have to see if that becomes a bigger issue now heading into champs in the later parts of this year.
So while Toronto and OpTic struggle in S&D, Atlanta FaZe, whose S&D went out the window in Major 3, they are now, I believe, 6-1 in search in these qualifiers. They lost an S&D to Carolina, but then ended up winning the Game 5 S&D against the Royal Ravens, and have not lost other than that in these qualifiers in that game mode. And that continued here against LAT. They win, or they lose the opening map, the hard point, and FaZe rattle off the remaining 3. I don't know, like it's shaping up very, very well for FaZe, that the teams that would theoretically give them the most issues and that have given them the most issues, with Toronto being the team that won Major 1, OpTic being the team that beat them and won Major 3. Those teams are really trying to figure out what's going wrong in search, while Atlanta is picking back up it seems like they're picking up steam. Do you think this is setting up very nicely for FaZe going in? You said we talked about with OpTic, you got to be playing your best Call of Duty at the end of the year. Atlanta is never not playing good Call of Duty, but they might be picking up and might be getting near their best Call of Duty again.
All I'll say is we've had 2 qualifiers this year. Was it? Hold on. No, we've actually, so in all 3 qualifiers this year, we've had a team go 7-0, and that team hasn't won that particular event in any instance. Atlanta went 7-0 Major 1 qualifiers. OpTic went 7-0 in Major 2 qualifiers, and Atlanta went 7-0 in the Major 3 qualifiers. So maybe Atlanta throws one of these qualifiers the window. I don't think they will, but jokes aside, yeah, I mean, it certainly feels like Atlanta's playing well and should be the favorites heading into Major 4, but I felt that way about last event too. To be fair, last event was when Atlanta hadn't lost a match in like 2 months or whatever it was at that point. It was, so a little bit different circumstances, but nonetheless, I feel like Atlanta's playing pretty well, should be the favorites heading into Major 4 here, barring some catastrophic collapse here in the final week of the Major 4 qualifiers.
Yeah, the one thing I really, really respect about FaZe, and this is multiple years now, and we've definitely glazed Atlanta like a lot on this podcast over the years. But the one thing I really respect about them is like a lot of these teams are up and down. Let's say OpTic, they win Major 3 and they are now 1-4, I believe, heading into the last week of these qualifiers. Toronto, we talked about it. They win Major 1, they look super dominant, and then they kind of get lost a little bit in the Major 2 qualifiers. They're not the same team, it looks like. FaZe just is like consistent. Like they might not win every single Major, and I believe there was some stat like FaZe's record on LAN like before like Sunday is like some ridiculous number, and then they have like a 500 record on like Championship Sunday of CDL events. But like the one thing I respect about FaZe is like they're gonna show up and like they're a super, super consistent team. You just look at their season standings, like they're gonna very likely be the number 1 seed again, which would be 5 straight years in the CDL to do that. They did it every single CDL season so far, and this these qualifiers have been kind of a testament to that. OpTic has kind of fallen off. At least they're losing. They're not able to keep up that consistent play all the time, whereas FaZe is just kind of doing what they're expected to do, and it may pay dividends down the road when we get to champs. But yeah, FaZe undefeated in these qualifiers, and it feels significant that they're able to do that.
I do want to just say, kind of glanced over it when we were talking about Toronto, and I guess you talking about historic glazing on the podcast made me realize I forgot to mention my boy Kleenex setting the record for hardpoint kills with 46 in that series against Minnesota today. So shout out to tissue being an issue in hardpoint now.
Shout out to Scrap for just throwing shade at Minnesota after the game, where he said, like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do when my opponent doesn't know what they're supposed to do. Just incredible. We already talked about the OpTic New York match. Obviously, huge win for the subliners. And then we finished off with, again, Daniel Say. He is on my list. He knows too much. The fix is in. So this is, I think, every single week of these qualifiers so far. There's been an odd match to finish these the week of qualifiers. One was OpTic playing, I think, Vegas, and I'm like, what the hell are we doing here? Like OpTic, like Vegas has been on a pretty long losing streak. They're pretty hopeless at this point. Vegas ends up winning. There was some other match where it made absolutely no sense. It was another upset. And this week we get LAG versus Vegas, the barn burner of all barn burners. And, LAG, bad online team. Vegas, kind of mediocre. They're, definitely, obviously, after they won earlier in the week against Seattle, you're thinking, okay, like that's a pretty big win for the Legion. But again, it's still the Legion versus the Gorillas. You expect the Legion to win. It doesn't work out quite like that. LAG, they sweep the Las Vegas Legion, and now that sets up, like, the biggest part about this is, one, LAG went 6-0 this week, which is incredible.
Yeah.
Another part of this is now we have a 4-way tie for the last spot at Champs. Of course, we do have a final week of qualifiers, and we have Major 4, but this sets up a gigantic week of implications. Daniel Say knows way too much, and the script has been written. I don't know what the final script says. I don't know who's getting that 8th spot, but it's ridiculous how this keeps working out. I was just jump ahead. LAT versus New York ends the online season for the CDL season. I don't think that's as ridiculous as a lot of these other matches have been, but I'm just expecting some kind of like controversy or something. Something's going to happen at LAT versus New York, and then I'm not going to show up to the next podcast because I'm going to have to fly out to LA and scope out Daniel Say, make sure that he's not doing something more nefarious. But yeah, LAG 6-0 this week, 2-0 in the series, and the 4-way tie at 140 points. So now, just to set the stage, Minnesota, LAG, Carolina, and Vegas are all tied at 140. LAT is 5 points ahead in 7th place at 145. According to the CDL website, Vegas would hold that 8th spot. I don't know if that's correct or not, but
It's got to be, yeah. They're 13 and 19. The other teams only have 12, 12, and 11 map wins. So then it's map win percentage too. They have the highest. They're 40%. The other teams are 34, 34, and 32. So I feel like they got the tiebreaker advantage there. That's why.
yeah. So obviously we have 7 teams separated by 20 points in the CDL from 5th to 11th. And in a 4-way tie for 8th place. What do you make of this? What do you make of my conspiracy theory? What do you make of the fact that we are now going down to the wire with 4 teams, well, really 7 teams, all vying for 4 spots?
Yeah, this was a very unexpected result that's leading to more chaos, I guess. And, I did say when I predicted Vegas to go 2-0 this week, I said I feel like every time I pick Vegas to go 2-0, they always let me down in some fashion. And I feel like if they were to go 1-1 this week, it would have been losing to Seattle and beating LAG. But nonetheless, here we are. They get 3-0'd by LAG. Like you said, 6-0 map count for LAG, 2-0 performance. So literally the best they could have done this week given their position. So kudos to them. But yeah, the tie and the points and everything where we're at now is just, it's shaping up to be one hell of an end of the season with one more week of these qualifiers, and then obviously some stuff can shift in this last week of the qualifiers coming up, but then the LAN is going to be make or break, and all these teams are going to know how many points they're at. They're going to know, like, hey, we got to make top 4 to make champs, right? Like, some teams are inevitably going to be in that situation, and then other teams are going to be like, okay, well, we just have to win one match, and these teams need to lose. It's gonna be intense, and like we said, I mean, not exactly the same scenario as we were kind of talking about Vegas last year, but it's sort of similar in the sense that all these teams where they are so close in the standings now, you can nitpick and think about what's happened earlier in the season. Like, like Vegas can sit back now and be like, damn, if we just beat LAG in this match, we'd be a little bit more ahead and feel a little bit better where we're at. But you can't think about that now. You just got to realize, at least given the place that you're in the standings, like, you still control your own fate. As long as you win, you don't have to necessarily worry about what the other teams are doing. Yeah, you don't want the teams around you to win. It would make things easier, but you just have to take care of business on your end, and then everything else will, however it shapes up, is what's going to happen. But if you win at the end of the day, then you're doing what you can to positively impact your placing, and that's all you can do. If you just lose, it's over. So yeah, get into the heart of it, and it's going to be interesting to see how it all shakes out.
I will say this: if you're listening to this podcast and for whatever reason you don't watch the CDO on a regular basis, or maybe you just don't tune in for like every week of the online qualifiers, understandably so. Some of these weeks are kind of a drag. This is a week of online qualifiers that you should tune in for. This is the most important week of online Call of Duty of the year. And there are not only for champs implications and it's tied into this, but we're talking about teams are, it's going to make or break on this week, whether they start in winner's bracket or loser's bracket for Major 4, which in turn will decide how much breathing room they will get for champs. I really like it, the difference between starting in winners and losers bracket for Major 4 and having like one more opportunity to get even more CDL points to win a match, to get 15 or 20 CDL points, that cannot be overstated at this point. So obviously if you're going to tune in for a week of online Call of Duty, this is the week to do it. I will quickly run through the standings. Before we do that, let me just say the pick'em right now. You are 146 and 66 for the season. You went 9-2 this week. I went 6-5. Not a great week for me. Probably one of my worst weeks of the season. And I am 138 and 74 on the year. Tremor, he's kind of like Boston right now. Winless, 0-1 for the year. But the standings, this is super, super important, obviously, for the year. So Atlanta, Toronto, New York, OpTic, those 4 teams are in. So OpTic is in third, like you mentioned earlier. They have slid to third. There was a shot that they would get the first seed. Right now, they're 60 points behind FaZe. Mathematically, it's possible, obviously, because FaZe could, technically double first round and OpTic, win Major 4 or whatever. But it's very much looking like FaZe will be the number 1 seed heading into champs for a 5th consecutive season. Toronto, 15 points ahead of OpTic, who OpTic has a sizable lead on New York. New York is, I think, about as secure in 4th place as any team can be. Then Miami and Seattle are tied for 5th. And then there's LAT in 7th at 145. And then Vegas, Carolina, LAG, Minnesota, all tied for 8th at 140. It looks like Vegas will have the tiebreaker in that. So right now, as we stand, if the season had ended today, the Vegas Legion would be going to champs. That's not how these things work, though. And we still have some matches to play. And then, obviously, the Boston Breach at 50 points. Are they technically? They are mathematically eliminated, right? Because there's no way to pick up 90-something points right now.
I mean...
No, because they have 2 matches technically, so
they have 2 matches left. They win every match and win Major 4. They got a shot.
Yeah, so technically, the Boston Breach have a shot. But yeah, they're out. But yeah, that's where we stand with the season standings, and I should just mention the qualifier standings real quick because it sets up pretty much this whole week. Obviously, FaZe, we mentioned 5-0. They have a chance to go undefeated for the 2nd time in the qualifiers. And then there's Toronto at 4-1, New York at 4-2, and then there's a 3-way tie for 4th place between Seattle, Miami, and Vegas, who are all coincidentally also fighting for champ spots. Seattle and Miami, I believe, are tied for 5th place in the CDL, if I'm not mistaken, or right around there. Obviously, Vegas on the line. They are in that tie for 4th. Then there's LAG. They only have one match this week, so if they win, they would get a winner's bracket spot at Major 4, which would be huge considering how poorly they've done online and, kind of how well relatively they've done on land this year. And then there's LAT in 8th place. They've played one fewer match than Carolina and Minnesota, who both have 20 CDL points in these qualifiers as well. So they definitely have the advantage there to pick up that last Major 4 winners bracket spot. And then there's OpTic, who is in 11th place right now. They can end up going 3-4 if they win out, but that honestly still might not be enough to get in. We'll see what happens with some of these other teams. And then obviously Boston 0-5, very likely going to not win a single match this week, and will probably not win a match the rest of the year. So that is the standings, and let's get into the pick'em for this week. Our final week of online Call of Duty for the season. It has been a long time. These qualifiers have been packed, and they're continuing to pack them again. There will be 3 matches on Friday, 4 matches on Saturday, and 3 matches on Sunday. Starting off with Miami versus Seattle, 2 teams I just mentioned. They would really love to win this, especially to establish themselves as that 5th place team. I'm going to go with Seattle. I don't think that there's a good team to pick here because they both have shown the ability to win this type of match.
Yeah, I'll take Seattle as well.
Atlanta versus Toronto. I can't pick against Atlanta most of the time, so I'm not going to here.
It's an interesting one, the Scrappy versus Draza drama could kick off, and obviously Toronto got the better of them at Major 3, but I'm still taking Atlanta here. And
we'll watch the S&D in particular in that series, see if that is something to really watch out for. Vegas versus LAT, about as pivotal of a match, is one of the most important matches in Legion franchise history. They really need this. I'm gonna go with LAT. Again, this is one of those matches where it's a coin flip. I can see this going either way very easily.
Yep, I'm gonna pick Vegas and just expect them to lose because I'm gonna keep on suffering. But yeah, I mean, especially with the way Vegas ended this week, it's kind of tough, but LAT also had an 0-2 week, even though LAT's losses were to Atlanta and Toronto. So I'm just going to go with Vegas.
And if Vegas wins this match, they would jump LAT in the standings. So LAT would slide to 8th place, and then it kind of depends on what happens with some of the other tiebreakers. Atlanta versus Miami to kick off Saturday. Atlanta, of course.
He's up.
LAG versus Seattle. I have a feeling LAG's 2-0, 6-0 week was kind of an anomaly, so I'm going to go with the Surge.
I mean, LAG beat Vegas, and Vegas beat Seattle, so, transitive property or whatever there, LAG should beat Seattle, but I will take Seattle too.
Obviously, a huge match for LAG. If Vegas wins, obviously on Friday, they would probably need to keep pace with Vegas. Then there is OpTic versus Boston. This should have ended the week. I would have gone insane if I saw this to end the week. I'll go with OpTic.
Yep, me too.
Vegas versus Minnesota, another very pivotal game. I'm gonna go with Vegas. I have been pretty down on Minnesota without accuracy, and it just feels like their season might kind of be over.
Yeah, I'm going to take Vegas too, which, just like last week, I'm going to say it, I'm picking them to go 2-0, which means they're inevitably not going to go 2-0, but I'm still going to go for it.
They would take 1-1, though. They would be pretty happy with it, I think. Sunday, June 23rd, the final day of online Call of Duty, OpTic versus Toronto, which, why would this not end the season? I have absolutely no idea. I will go with, man, that is a tough match because they are both kind of stinky and search and destroy. And I'll say I'll say Toronto because they've shown a little more consistency of late. That's not a huge, that's not a hot
Yeah.
take, but I just feel a little more comfortable with the Ultra right now.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with Toronto too. And like I said, somebody has to win map 2 in this series, and I can't wait to see which team it is.
Carolina versus Boston. This is the real test because if Carolina loses this, I believe that Clayster has officially been cursed. He sold his soul to win that championship in 2020. There's no other explanation, because this would be like a this would be a horrible loss that would probably end their season. Like, not technically, but I think in reality, I will go with the Ravens. But I'm very scared for Clayster in Carolina.
This is kind of similar to Boston this week, though, right? Like Boston this week played Atlanta. We were both kind of like, yeah, barring something super weird happening, there's no shot. And then Boston plays LAG, and that's a match that's technically winnable. And now this final week coming up, they're playing OpTic, regardless of OpTic's, standings. That shouldn't be comparable to playing Atlanta in the sense of it's just almost a not winnable match for them. Then they play Carolina, which could be a very winnable match. So definitely an interesting one, but I'm gonna have to go with Carolina and stick with the losing streak for Boston.
This would be the first like win in like 3 months for them, for Boston
Yeah.
or something. So it's I I
Since
cannot
last year and Easton left.
I cannot fathom. LAT versus New York to end the year, to end the regular season, or end the online regular season. Man, I will go with New York, but I think more highly of LAT than those other bottom 8 teams. I just don't think of them that highly.
Yeah, I'm
But
gonna go with New York too.
But the fact that it's ending the week seems notable, at least from what we've seen over the past few weeks. So yeah, that does it for today's show. Obviously, a little bit longer, a lot of implications for this week. Again, I implore you to tune in this week, and watch at least a few of these online qualifiers, like that. Let me try to pick out a match or two. Like, obviously, if you want to watch like the best teams or teams that are at the very top, Atlanta versus Toronto, OpTic versus Toronto, like those matches are very notable just because those are three of the 3 championship contenders, and then there's New York as well. But obviously, like LAG versus Seattle could be very interesting. Vegas versus Minnesota can be that could get messy, but that could be a really, really fun match. Standy revenge game, who knows? Carolina Boston, if you want to watch Boston get their whatever that would be, their 17th consecutive loss, most likely. So a lot of very fun matches this week, and you can tune in on YouTube if you would like to. But we appreciate you guys listening and watching and supporting us all season long. We're almost to the end of the year. Just have the Major 4 preview next week, and then we have, I think you said, a week between Major 4, or 2 weeks between Major 4 and then Champs. So we can kind of do like an in memoriam for the teams that don't make Champs after Major 4, kind of talk about them a little bit more in depth. And obviously we'll have our Champs preview the week that Champs starts in a few weeks. So thank you for listening or watching. You can follow the podcast feed or subscribe to it. We're on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. You can follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Pres Byers, and the podcast tour is at Ego Chall Podcast. We'll be back sometime early next week. The show, if you're not familiar, we do a live stream on twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. It's usually either Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday. We'll see what happens. Obviously, happy Father's Day, if we didn't say that at the top of the show, to any of the dads out there. But we'll be back early next week to talk about all of the matches, how the online season ended. We'll preview Major 4, all of that good stuff. That does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys as always for all the support. Like Preston said, we're getting towards the end here, and notably getting to the end of the online portion. So one more week online matches, and then we got one more regular season LAN and champs. So can't wait to break it all down with you. Hope you guys enjoyed the streams and the pods lately. Let us know if you got any feedback and whatnot. And other than that, we'll see you next week when we do see you. Remember to send the chow.